Welcome everybody to our third installment of this year's Twilight Talks, all centered around Victorian botanical pursuits, entitled Botanical Bliss. I am Michael Mailer, and I am the Regional Site Administrator for Historic New England for Boston's Metro region. And I'm happy to see a lot of you back from our last two talks. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. 2 weeks ago, if you were here, we had Lisa Pearson talking from the Arnold Arboretum. Last week, Meg Winslow from Mount Auburn Cemetery. And as we get to this week's illustrious speaker, next week we have Jennifer Brown, who will be talking about the glass flowers from Harvard. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that. A couple of quick housekeeping items. We are recording this tonight. And number two, if you have questions for Judith, feel free to put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or chat. I should be able to monitor either one. Then when we get to the end, we will answer as many, if not all, as we can. So without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Judith Sumner, who is a botanist who specializes in flowering plants, plant adaptations, garden history, and ethnobotany. She attended Vassar College and earned a doctorate in botany at the University of Massachusetts, working under the direction of Albert Charles Smith. Judith has taught extensively, both at the college level and at botanical gardens, including the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University and Garden in the Woods. She has been a visiting researcher at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, British Museum Natural History, and Jardin des Plantes, pardon my French, it's never very good, in Paris. Her extensive work in the Pacific region resulted in monographs on the genus Pittosporum in several publications, including Flora Vitiensis Nova, the new flora of the Fiji Islands. Her other projects in the area of interest have included field studies in the Great Smoky Mountains, work with Aid Santo Domingo on developing petroleum-rich plants, and a commitment to science education. She recently published, which I think we're going to see a little bit of tonight, Plants Go to War, A Botanical History of World War II, which includes chapters on victory gardens and agriculture, as well as timber, fibers, rubber, medicinal plants, and herbalism, camouflage, survival practices, and botanical gardens in wartime. And lastly, Judith has been the lecturer in residence at the Star Island Natural History Conference and has been a guest on Martha Stewart Living television show, PBS program Cultivating Life with Sean Conway, and other PBS and educational programs. During the summer, she has served as a visiting scientist in the LEAP program at the Arnold Arboretum and has conducted numerous workshops for the Museum Institutes for Teaching Science. So with that illustrious introduction, I will turn things over to Judith. Judith, you say hello. I'm going to be running the slides tonight, so when you're ready, you let me know.
Okay, hello everybody. I cannot see you, but I guess you can see me and you can see my slides. I'm delighted to be here tonight with all of you. And we're going to be talking about Victorian women and their work in botany and gardening. And before we start on Victorian women, I just want to put down a little context before we talk about Victorian women and say a bit about the 18th and early 19th centuries, because there were plenty of women who were doing botany during those earlier times. Women were busy with household tasks, with cooking, with preserving food, with cultivating kitchen gardens to provide essential fruits, vegetables, and herbs and medicines, with spinning and weaving and dyeing textiles. This left them little time for recreational gardening and plant study, but it certainly turned them into practical botanists. And so botanical knowledge certainly did not start with Victorian times, nor did horticultural knowledge. Women in this country have always been good botanists. And so now we'll go to the first slide, Michael, if you can.
Sure.
Next slide. Great. So just imagine early settlers coming to the New World, and they brought with them satchels and baskets and bundles of clothing and bedding. And in those various bundles and satchels, there were seeds and cuttings of plants that they wanted to grow here in the New World. And they also brought with them stillroom books like the one by Gervais Markham that you can see on the right side there. These were essentially not only cookbooks, but books of medicinal plants, herbology, what to grow it, how to cook it, how to preserve foods, a lot of practical botany in these books. So just imagine this during the 17th and 18th centuries. Next slide. And many women had still rooms. And if you were wealthy enough, you actually had a copper still, which you can see on the right there. These were the rooms where herbs were dried and they were preserved for use in medicine. It's where the essential oils were distilled using the distillation apparatus. And so not only practical botany, but practical chemistry as well. And the next slide shows the first of two plants that I want to mention that have had a history inextricably linked with women. And the first of these you recognize as Queen Anne's lace. Queen Anne's lace is actually nothing more than a wild carrot. It's the exact same genus and species as the cultivated carrot that we all know. But this is a wildflower that was brought to the New World. And why was it brought to the New World? Look at that Roman coin over there on the right. You can see Queen Anne's lace, or maybe its larger relative, which is now extinct, that was known as silphium or silphium, was introduced because women found it a very, very important plant for family planning, for controlling the number of children that were born. It is both an abortifacient and also seems to block progesterone synthesis in mammals. And so if you are pregnant and you swallow a handful of the little dried fruits, we think of them as seeds of Queen Anne's lace, the pregnancy probably will not survive. And then the next slide shows another plant that women found particularly important. And note that these are now wild, right? These are plants that we find all over New England growing on the roadsides and in fields and disturbed sites. Why? Because so many of them were introduced. They're weedy plants, they escaped gardens. And here's another one of them. This is tansy. And tansy was very important for mothers who were fighting parasitic worm infections in their children. Parasitic worm infections now are fairly rare, but if you think about how children were being raised, sitting in the dooryards, sitting in the soil, the hand to mouth to soil contact, animals walking in the same area, a good deworming was essential at least once a year, and tansy was the plant to do it. The problem with tansy is that the dose to actually get rid of the worms is pretty close to the lethal dose for a baby. But tansy was in some of the early vermifuge medicines that were used. Look at that bouncing baby over there, just been dewormed by a good dose of tansy, and then became linked in the Anglican Church to Mothering Sunday, Lighten Up Sunday. It's a Sunday well into Lent. It's when the rose-colored hangings are used in the Anglican Church, and tansy was even used to flavor the cake, the simnel cake associated with Mothering Sunday that mothers would bake to give to their mothers, and young maids would bake to take home to their mothers as well. Next slide. And then, of course, all of the plants besides tansy and besides Queen Anne's lace that are in herb gardens. And you recognize several of these: lavender in the upper left, and sage just below it on the lower left, and peppermint and bee balm on the lower right. And these were all herbs that were known to women before the Victorian age. These are the plants they used to doctor their families, to preserve food, to make teas, to keep insects out of their homes as strewing herbs. And then notice that inset right in the middle. That is the Boston Tea Party. And that's there to remind me to mention that these are the same herbs that were used in making Liberty teas. So after patriots in New England decided not to drink imported tea anymore in the early 1770s, what were they going to have in place of tea? And the women knew these herbs. They knew they were reasonably safe in some small doses, and they started brewing up Liberty tea mixtures out of these garden herbs. Some good practical botany. Next slide. So what I want you to remember is the next time you see a reconstructed herb garden at a historic property, you just think about all of the botanical knowledge that women had coming into the New World and setting up their homes. And this is what women had historically and culturally, as we start in with the Victorian era. Now, the Victorian era, as you know, embraced the 19th century from the 1840s until about the turn of the century. There were fewer families during the Victorian era who had to grow everything that they needed. There were more commercial products available. There was ready-made clothing, foods, pharmaceuticals. And so people were not having to grow and spin and doctor themselves and use dye plants. There were more commercial products available. And so there was comparatively more time for leisure, for recreation, for interests and avocations, academic pursuits, field study. And this even for women included botany and gardening. The next slide. I want to say a little bit about garden history at this time. Andrew Jackson Downing, and you can see his dates there, first half of the Victorian era. He wrote a wonderful book, A Treatise on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening. It was published in 1849. Downing was an American gardener who adapted the English style of landscape gardening to the scale of American homes, and so downsized the vast scale of English landscape gardening that we find at some of the great houses now in England to something that would fit an American homestead. And his teachings, his ideas involved having plenty of trees, but these were in the background. So a background you can see there of diverse trees and then flower gardens near the homestead. And these naturalistic tree groves planted to look as if nature planted them, but in fact, they are part of landscape design in the background. He encouraged gardening near homes. And the next slide shows you what some of those plants might have been in the earliest years of the Victorian era. And these are many of the same plants that we would have seen in a colonial dooryard garden. They're plants that have some use. And maybe by the Victorian era, the plants were not being used for their original uses, but they were still being grown because they are attractive. So if you look in the upper left there, that's a plant that's very common in New England. It's known as bouncing bet. And it was originally introduced from England here by colonists who planned to grow wool, planned to raise sheep and cultivate the wool and clean the wool. And this plant makes soapy compounds that will actually cut through lanolin. And so it was a handy plant to have around. It also was regarded as a cure for venereal diseases. Now, see, that's a pink one. The original wild type ones were white, but by the time this was basically converted into a garden plant, women would see the occasional pink mutation and say, oh, that's the one I want. And so the garden varieties tended toward being pink. Right below it, you recognize lily of the valley. A lily of the valley was used as a medicinal plant. It contains cardiac glycosides that can control heart activity, much like foxglove. But it was an ideal garden plant because it's easily propagated. You don't have to grow it from seed. You can just take some of the rhizomes, give them to your neighbor, give them to your friend, and she can plant them in her garden. Up at the very top in the middle, you see a plant that you might know it as Johnny Jump Up. The old name for it is Heart's Ease. The bottommost petal has the little shape of a heart. And according to the old medieval doctrine of signatures, that meant this plant was good for heart ailments. Is it actually good for heart ailments? Not really, I don't think so. But this plant was enjoyed. It was a pretty little plant to have. And it became, it was the starting point for the cultivation of pansies, of horticultural pansies. And we'll talk more about that later. Upper right there, those beautiful red poppies are actually opium poppies. Did people grow opium at their homes? Absolutely. If we look at, for instance, Lydia Maria Child's books, she talks about growing opium poppies and using the capsules and using the stems to poach in water and make an opium syrup. And she says, be careful because we don't know the strength of it. No true words have ever been spoken, one mother to another. But yes, people still grew opium poppies. They're commonly known as breadseed poppies. Not that they were necessarily making opium for themselves anymore in the middle of the 19th century, but really because it was just a nice plant. Then in the lower right, you see yarrow. Now, yarrow, if you find it growing out on the roadside or in a field somewhere, is typically white. And it's the same thing. Occasionally you get a pink mutation, and those are the ones that people began cultivating in their gardens. Yarrow had many uses. It's actually named for Achilles. It's the genus Achillea, and it was known as a hemostat, something that if you got a bad cut, this would stop the bleeding. Has about 100 bioactive compounds. So we are just beginning to understand all of the medicinal potential of yarrow. And so just imagine a nice little cottage garden occupied by some early Victorian family members, and these garden flowers growing near the house in a nice little garden. Next slide. There was a vast body of literature that appeared during the Victorian era about women in their homes, and much of that involved gardening in their homes. And one of my personal favorites of these books is The American Woman's Home, and it has two famous authors, Catherine Beecher and her even better known sister, who was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And if you look there at the inset at the very bottom center, you can see the entire Stowe family. Harriet, I think, is second from the left on the first row, and her sister, Catherine, is the woman all the way over on the right on the first row. And we'll mention their brother, Henry Ward Beecher, who's the man on the extreme right. We'll come to him in a minute. But The American Woman's Home, if you have read it, you know, covers really all aspects of the American woman's home: how to manage your kitchen, how to decorate, how to organize the bedrooms, how to store foods, how to do everything. But notice what is on the cover of the book. Of all of these various topics involved with making a home and being a homemaker in the 19th century, what do they have on the cover? Well, gardens around the home, right in the center there. It's part of the sphere of influence of women, and 3 generations of women at work in their own little garden. Look at the very bottom, the grandmother, the mother, and probably her child. And so obviously they were lifting up gardening and horticulture and managing your home with the same precise techniques that you would use in your garden as an icon for women to embrace. And there's some more pictures from the American Woman's Home. I want to say a little bit about Henry Ward Beecher, the brother who's illustrated there. You can see him in the photograph. He's mentioned he's the last man over on the extreme right. You all remember him. He was a minister and abolitionist, and during the 1870s, he became embroiled in an infamous adultery case involving Elizabeth Stilton, from which he was eventually exonerated, but we're not here today to talk about adultery. Want to mention him today because he wrote a book called Plain and Pleasant Talks about fruits, flowers, and farming. It was published in 1859. And in this book, Henry talks about women. And he was enormously concerned that women by the 1850s were spending too much time indoors. And what were they doing? Well, they were working, according to him, on needlework, painting rice paper, casting wax flowers. He believed all of this indoor activity led to morbid tastes, nervous disorders, feebleness, diminished health. Whereas if the women just got outdoors in the fresh air with their trowels and their gardening dress on, and they did some digging and got some exercise, and they rose early and exhibited some industry, and this all led to powers of close observation, really desirable habits, that it was really much healthier for women to take up gardening and spend all their time inside trying to replicate plants from every possible material, which was one of his comments. You know, why not go out and see real plants rather than plants made of wax and hair and everything else? And I must say, there was an element of truth to this. Many women during this time did suffer from vitamin D deficiencies because they lived indoor lives. They had the clothing that they had in many cases was unsuitable to outdoor activities. There was a reluctance to do heavy tasks, and had they gotten outside, they probably would have been, in many cases, much healthier. And the next slide. The next slide shows you what this ideal would be. Those two robust women carrying the produce that they have made, and then the beautiful tended homestead, the gardens that women could grow if they just got outside and practiced this sort of horticulture. The next slide shows you that this type of thinking had support from some other quarters as well. Now, everybody has heard of Lydia Pinkham. She was here in Massachusetts. She lived from 1819 to 1883, so she was really the penultimate Victorian herself. And when her family was strapped for cash, she had developed a vegetable compound that was a proprietary recipe. She never really told the details of how it was prepared, so it was proprietary, that contained some fairly potent plants, including black cohosh, which now we know to be estrogenic, butterfly weed, which is loaded with cardiac glycosides, colic root. And what I want to mention, though, is her style of advertising involved testimonials, and also women who purchased her vegetable compound could write in, and she had a staff of correspondents who answered queries from women. And women's problems were ubiquitous. Women could not have children. Women were exhausted. They were nervous. Look at that one up there. Tired, nervous mothers should profit by the experience of these two women. And then you have testimonials there. Now, one of the big pieces of advice her correspondents dispensed to the customers was, get outside, do some gardening, dig with a trowel, do some walking, enjoy the outdoors, enjoy plants, enjoy flowers. And, we don't know how well this medicine worked, but it was actually pretty good advice to women. Don't spend all your day inside, get outside and do some gardening. Next slide. And just to show you the extent of the literature that was written during this time, and if we just skim the titles, we can see where women were devoting their effort and where the authors of these books thought that women should devote their effort. Every lady her own flower gardener, so get out and grow a garden. The parlor gardener, so have a nice garden to admire near your parlor window. Flowers for parlor and garden, so grow some plants you could bring inside. The window gardener, you don't have a parlor, or you don't have a parlor garden, have a little window box. Window gardening, devoted especially to the culture of flowers and ornamental plants for indoor use and parlor decoration. So have a little window garden, and then you can bring some of these inside for decor. Household elegancies covered not only gardening, but also the sorts of things you could do inside your home involving plants. Ladies' fancy work. How could you render botanical designs into various types of stitchery and other craft work? Floral decorations for the dwelling house, much of the same. Winter greeneries at home. So gardening does not have to be limited just to the outdoors in the summer. You can do gardening inside. Houseplants. Every woman her own flower gardener. And then the last one, ferns in their homes and ours. And ferns became an entire branch of gardening and horticulture unto themselves, and we'll talk a bit about that later. Next slide. So after the Civil War in the US, there was a colossal shift in the style of gardening that was being practiced. If we go back to Andrew Jackson Downing, he had suggested that people could, if they wanted, start cutting openings in their lawns near their homes and actually making little flower beds cut directly into the lawn. And this was so unbelievably radical at the time. If you think about it, early gardens tended to be near buildings, against walls, or maybe a walled garden. Having plants out in the middle of the open was really quite an avant-garde idea. And After the Civil War, we really see this idea of flower beds in the lawns being adopted in American gardens. And these pictures, by the way, are from the Mohonk Mountain House Hotel, which is a Victorian hotel in New Paltz, New York. If you have not been there, or if you have been there, you know that even as we speak, they do plant Victorian gardens and do trials of many of the descendants, the genetic descendants of the plants that were grown during the Victorian era. And the one thing I want you to notice is just the amount of color. The reds, the oranges, the yellows, the cerises, the magentas that are in these gardens that are cut directly into the lawn. So what actually were the plants that were being grown in this way? So the next slide shows you not only did we have a shift in the style of gardening, but we have a shift now in the plants themselves. No more bouncing bet, no more little herbs, no more heartsease. Well, maybe a little heartsease, we'll get to that. But now, by the end of the Civil War, tremendous widespread interest in plants that have been discovered through worldwide exploration, introduced into Europe, introduced into the US by botanical explorers who were going all over Africa, Asia, and South America. And so you can see what some of these are. In the upper left, geraniums. So geraniums have an interesting history. They actually had been introduced in the early 1700s, but somehow they were viewed as a plant that you would grow in a pot. You would never stick it in the ground. But by Victorian times, people realized you can actually grow them in the ground, and they make pretty decent bedding plants. So these are all bedding plants to grow in flower beds. In the middle there at the top, you recognize Coleus. Coleus has all kinds of wildly variegated leaves. It's actually a member of the mint family. The original wild Coleus were native to Java, and through selection and crossbreeding, little hybridization, all sorts of patterns of leaf variation were developed. Way over on the right, top row, you recognize Impatiens. Impatiens are also are from Asia. They are fast growing, they are colorful, and they were shade tolerant. Most of these plants had to have bright sun, but Impatiens, if you had a shade spot, Impatiens was a plant that you could grow there. Second row, way over on the left, that's a pretty close to a wild petunia. And petunias originally came from South America. It was a couple of different species. They were hybridized. Their color range goes from white to pink to purple to red. The white ones were pollinated at night by moths. The colored ones were pollinated in the daytime by bees. And they also became extremely popular. In the center, you recognize marigolds. Those were native to Mexico, Central and South America. Way over on the right, middle row, you recognize Celosia, coxcomb. That's from Asia. And remember that, because we're going to see a bizarre mutant form of that became a Victorian favorite in a couple of slides. Bottom row on the left, begonias. Those came from South America and Asia. And then the little fuzzy ageratum over on the bottom right, that was from Mexico. Now, what was it that these plants had that the traditional garden plants that people had been growing in their little dooryard or parlor gardens did not have? Well, these plants in their native habitat are all perennials. They will just keep on growing. But in this country, they were in temperate habitat. Here, they were being grown as annuals. And they would keep flowering for the entire season. And not only that, they had wild, bright colors. So you could put them in once the danger of frost was over in the spring, and they would just flower maniacally, brightly all summer long. And then if you wanted to keep some of them, you could put them in pots and bring them in your house for the fall and winter. They did not go to seed and die. But it was the colors that people found particularly attractive, and also their low growth. Because imagine, you could have these flower beds and the plants are low to the ground, so women and children could kneel, they could dig in the soil, They could move them around, make all kinds of interesting patterns. And that was why we see this tremendous shift. It's a development between a change in style, actually putting the gardens directly in the lawn, and then having access to plant material that was really worldwide, represented the worldwide tropics. The next slide shows you the one exception to what I just said. And here we are back to the little Johnny jump up flower that was known at the time as Heart's Ease. So now you can see that bottom petal. It's actually the petal where the bee lands. On many of them, that petal is shaped like a little heart. And so the old doctrine of signatures said, oh, these plants must be good for treating ailments of the heart. This is not true. But look, it's a nice little flower, right? And you can see the yellow center that's attractive to bees. Those are carotenoid pigments that are going to look dark to a bee. And so a bee is going to want to explore that opening in the middle of the flower. And then you see those little thin, very deep purple, almost black markings. Looks like somebody took a little Sharpie and made them pointing right to the center of the flower. So that was the starting point for breeding domesticated horticultural pansies, because every now and then a mutation would show up and those little lines that point to the middle of the flower would be a little bit bigger. And actually, if you look at that bit of Victorian scrap there that's right in the middle of the top row, can you see in that the lines pointing to the middle of the flower are a little wider and they're beginning to coalesce. And then by the time you get to the horticultural pansies in the clay pot down there on the lower left, my word, those have now become big, dark spots. And people saw these as little faces. So these were considered friendly little plants. They were a great favorite. They came in a color range from yellow to blue and violet and mahogany colors. They thrived in the shade like Impatiens. They thrived in cool sites. They were great spring and fall favorite bedding plants. And then you could dig them up and bring them inside the house if you wanted for a while. There were pansy societies. All sorts of pansy seeds were sold that you could grow on your own. And there was even, during the 1880s, you can see on the lower right there, there was a children's gardening publication called The Pansy. And the writing in this publication encouraged diligence and morality and benevolence. And the author addressed all of the children who read it as my little pansies. Now, in case all of this sounds too sweet for you, I want to also point out that there was a Victorian interest in plants with peculiar traits, some of which involved death. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, so we shift here and we talk about some of the Victorian interest in plants with peculiar traits, and some of it verges on the macabre. So in the upper left there, you see a little viney plant that was known as Kenilworth ivy. It looks innocuous enough, and what actually interested the Victorian gardener was a little trait that it had of actually burying its flowers. And so the plant would flower, and once those flowers had been pollinated and the seeds were forming, the stem that the flower was on would start to elongate madly and push the flower right into the rocks. And so this typically grew on rock walls, and it basically self-planted. The flower with its developing seeds would get pushed into a crack, and lo and behold, the seeds would germinate, and out of the crack would come another plant or plants of Kenilworth ivy. So that one's pretty innocuous. Now look at the one to its right, the middle of the top row. Here is the bizarre mutant form of Celosia. So this was a mutation that occurs occasionally in nature, in which the flowers all fuse together into a big velvety mass. And the Victorian gardener apparently found this just fascinating, very interesting, very sort of Victorian, I suppose, in the color and in sort of the elaborate structure of that big velvety mass. So these were very popular as well. Now we'll get to some of the more macabre ones. Top right, this is a plant that was known as the cruel plant. It is actually a vine, a Rauchia cercifera, that is from South America. And it looks innocuous enough, but the pollen on it is extremely sticky. so sticky that when an insect visits the flower, the insect often gets stuck on the pollen and cannot get out and dies in situ. And so seeds for this were sold, and the gardener was told, you know, you can get this, and basically you will see insects dying because the plant is so cruel. The plant actually will trap insects. A little bit more trapping of insects, bottom row, way on the left there, that plant that looks like it has a pocket form is Calceolaria, often known as the pocketbook plant. And this was a great Victorian favorite as well. The original wild plants came from Chile. They're relatives of snapdragons. Each flower has a pouch of fused petals that can actually capture and hold a bee. So a bee goes in there and has a little trouble finding its way out. And this was considered extremely amusing. There were countless hybrids of this. The catalogs advertised Calceolaria hybrid seeds, and you could get them, and literally each seed would develop into a new form of a new type of flower of Calceolaria because of the hybrid nature. Another plant that actually trapped insects and held them and actually killed them was right in the middle there, lower row, second row, right in the middle. That is the native Beecher plant. It's Sarracenia. This grows in bogs all over New England. If you're not familiar with it, it's because the plant really is limited to bogs as its natural habitat. But people did dig this up, and they started putting it in terrariums, and they were interested in its nature. It's basically a hollow tubular leaf which accumulates rainwater. Bacteria start to grow in the rainwater, and insects fall in, they cannot get out, and they are dissolved, and the nutrients that are in the insect are actually absorbed by the plant. And I'll just read you a little quotation from Wildflowers and Where They Grow, published in 1882. The author says, "Our superb Sarracenia entraps insects in that fatal cup and destroys, devours, absorbs, or in some way annihilates them." And then the last plant I'll mention that appealed to Victorian tastes is the South American sensitive plant. That's second row, way over on the right. If you've seen this, you know, if you brush against the plant, two things happen. All those little leaflets fold in, and then the entire little short branch they're on folds down. Probably an adaptation to hungry herbivorous mammals looking for a nice leafy meal. But you can imagine how this would have appealed to the Victorians. They thought it was really extremely interesting that a plant seemed to have animal-like traits, and if you brush against it, it would shy away from you. The next slide. And then there was a certain amount of interest in plants that really were grotesque in some way. And so look in the middle there. That is something that you could install in your garden if you had the space for it. The plant in the middle is a castor bean plant. And notice how big it gets. That might be slightly exaggerated, but it is a robust plant. It's in the euphorb family. Two things it makes. First of all, it makes castor oil. And that's why it was being grown in New England herb gardens, because it's an African plant, and it was a valued early introduction because castor oil is a very excellent laxative. And you have to remember, the 19th century was a time of vast troubles with constipation. Constipation was a national scourge, especially because of the wintertime diet without many fresh fruits and vegetables. And so castor bean was originally grown medicinally, but then you can imagine the Victorian mindset. Look at those dark leaves. Look at those fabulous red clusters of flowers. This thing really might be worth cultivating. And then all around the base, what do we have? Caladium. And caladium is it's a relative of philodendron, actually. It's from tropical America. It grows from sort of a bulb-like rhizome. And what's interesting here is this taste for dark and wildly variegated foliage, and just the size of the whole thing. It's not really beautiful, it's really grotesque, but this was something that appealed to much of the Victorian taste. And then, next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the Victorian interest in ferns. And this particularly attracted women. And so ferns, as you know, have a structure that resembles a feather. There's a main stalk and then little botanists call them pinnae. They're sort of little leaflets that go off on the sides. And they do tend to have a very delicate shape, very beautiful. Many of them will grow in the shade. And the Victorian love of ferns, in the literature it's often referred to as pteridomania, was able to bridge both outdoor and indoor gardening, because you could have ferns indoors. And then, like those good women in the upper left, you could get outside and actually have a field trip in which you really spent your time hunting for ferns. And of course, the whole pteridomania movement really did influence culture. Everyone has seen the cast iron garden benches that are molded to look like fern fronds. Look at that piece of jasperware there in the upper right, where the ferns are rendered in clay and applied to the jasperware. And then the whole idea of growing ferns indoors in some sort of a glass case, we'll talk about that more in a minute, or outdoors in a fernery or a rockery. Of course, ferns were ideal for indoor spaces because indoor spaces in the Victorian era tended to be dark. And so any kind of shade-loving plant that was adapted to low light would probably do pretty well, especially in a pot or some kind of a terrarium. Next slide. So I want to say two words about fern life cycles. So, and if we go back to the 18th century and the Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus, he lived from 1707 to 1778, and he tasked himself with categorizing, classifying, and naming every known plant. And he was completely perplexed by ferns. He decided there was some sort of reproduction going on, but he classified them with the plants that, in his mind, were getting married secretly. He called them the cryptogams. Crypt meaning secret, and gammy meaning married. So these were plants with secret marriages, secret to him ways of reproducing. Now, he did not have a good microscope. Now we understand what happens with ferns, is that on the back of a fern leaf, and you see that in the upper right, there are spore cases. So each of those little fuzzy brown dots is actually several spore cases. Each spore case can make up to hundreds of spores. One of those spores bounces out, lands on the moist soil, and grows. And you see that strange little green leafy structure in the lower left. So that would be about as big as the nail on your smallest finger, no more than about maybe ½ an inch in diameter. And on the surface of that, what do we find? We find sex organs. There are little spherical structures that make sperm, and there are little round structures with a little open neck that contain eggs. And one day, when it rains out or there's a heavy dew, the sperms swim over to the eggs and they fertilize them. This is all microscopic. And then on the surface, look at the lower right there, in the second row, we see a little plant growing. And so this is fern sexual reproduction. There are not seeds. And so this actually was something that was occurring in American homes. Next slide. When women began growing ferns in Wardian cases. So a Wardian case is actually named for the original inventor, who was Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward. He was a London physician and naturalist who came up with the idea of a glass case. Now we call it a terrarium for shipping ferns. So if you were, you can just imagine, if you were a tropical plant collector or somebody doing botanical exploration in the tropics and you found ferns, getting those living specimens back to a botanical garden was very difficult because you couldn't pick up seeds and the spores don't last that long. And so a glass case was just perfect. So that was the original intention of the Wardian case design, to move plants back to centers of study, to botanical gardens where they could be studied and classified. But then the Wardian cases were adapted and really designed. They were sort of leveled up, if you will, into all sorts of interesting designs. You can even see Gothic revival going on there, beautiful ones made of wood and glass. And so these were used for cultivating primarily ferns inside of homes. And so by the 1860s, tremendous popularity of these large terraria for any plants, but primarily ferns that need high humidity and protection from pollutants. And I will digress briefly and say that the air quality in American homes was absolutely abysmal for ferns and many other plants as well, actually for the people. Why is this? Well, people were burning illuminating gas, and they were also burning coal. And both illuminating gas and coal release not just carbon dioxide and water when they're burned, but some incomplete products of combustion, including ethylene, which is C2H4. And believe it or not, ethylene is a natural plant hormone. If you've heard the old adage, one rotten apple will spoil the whole barrel, it is true, because one rotting apple releases ethylene and signals all the other apples to over-ripen and perhaps begin to decay. So this is exactly what was happening in American homes. All of this ethylene was in the air from the coal, from the gas lamps, and it was a pretty tough place to be if you were a plant, because you were getting this gaseous message, a hormonal message, basically to drop your leaves, and it was the end of the growing season. Whereas plants that were held in these glass cases really could thrive, even if there wasn't much light, because most ferns have a very, very low light requirement. And notice the designs, we have designs here for the wealthy and also for the less wealthy. The first image on the left, look at the one on the upper left there. That's nothing more than a table with a glass covering on it. And some of the household books, including Catherine Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe, they say, you know, if you want one of these, don't feel you have to go and buy a fancy one. Just get a table and rig up some sort of a glass covering over it, and you can have your own Wardian case. Next slide. And another very popular pastime, in addition to growing gardens outside and terranomania, having gardens inside, was the whole idea of collecting and pressing dried specimens. And it became so popular that you could actually purchase a book, and basically it would be a book with large sheets of paper all bound together. And you can see some of the tools of the trade in the bottom image there over on the extreme left. That green metal cylinder with a little trap door in it is called a vasculum. It has a strap. You wear it over your shoulder, and you collect your plant specimens in that, and then you bring them home. And on the right, with the straps and the wooden grid, top and bottom, encasing absorbent paper, basically blotter paper and newspaper. That's a plant, that's a professional plant press, but plenty of women had these. And if you could afford one, you would get one, and you would go out and you would collect specimens, and you'd get right home and you would dry them as quickly as you could. And then you would open up your herbarium pages and you would arrange them. You might make some notes about where you found them. You might arrange them artistically. You might arrange them really more for a straight botanical study as a record of what you found on that particular adventure in the field. Next slide. And then from the herbarium of land plants, we make a little horizontal shift to the coastlines, where many women became fascinated by algae. Now, algae have noticed some of that same feather-like growth that we see in ferns. So I don't think it's a coincidence that algae appealed to Victorian women, because it's really the same sort of a similar design in many cases. Algae are coastal plants. They were available if you lived along the coast and you could get to the tide pools. All you had to do was get to the beach and tuck your dress into your bloomers so that it didn't get wet, and wade out there with some cardstock. And the idea was you would actually float the algae right onto the cardstock and then dry it and press it. So again, wonderful collections of this that have been made. Some of them have now been digitized. And I'll just mention, why did this actually work? Well, algae do contain some complex carbohydrates, particularly the ones that spend part of the day in a tidal area where, you know, the tide goes in and the tide goes out, And during that time, the algae can get dry. And by having these hydrocolloids in their cell walls, it's basically like a sponge. And so the algae stays moist even during low tide. And what that means is that it's sort of a sticky substance, and it will actually glue the algal specimen that you've floated onto the cardstock, and it will dry right there in situ. I'm sure you know there are all kinds of commercial uses for these hydrocolloids, including some like the less expensive brands of ice cream even have like compounds like carrageenan, which is one of these. So you can just imagine this was another popular hobby. Next slide. And today I would challenge you to go and find a china pattern that has on it algae. But look at these two china pieces here. The one on the top is a large urn, probably for growing a big indoor fern or maybe a potted palm. And we look at it carefully, and what do we find? Algae on it. And then the plate, again, we look at it closely, and what in the world is that pattern? It is actually algae. Now, it's usually women who buy the china, who select the china patterns. And so I think this says something about where their interests were. Next slide. And I have to mention a little bit about china painting. This could be a talk unto itself. But there was a lot of interest in reproducing images on china of botanical subjects. And, it was a common hobby. Women took classes in it. It's amazing the incredible detail that some of these show. And I have only the greatest admiration for the women who did this. The one on the lower right there was actually done by one of my great aunts. And really, the botanical detail in this thing is incredible. And the way this worked is that you would buy the blank. You would buy a blank piece of china, and then you would paint it. And the next slide shows some more of the likenesses of flowers that were rendered using all sorts of different materials. I'm afraid this is what Henry Ward Beecher was talking about, women staying inside and using every possible material they could get their hands on, from human hair up there in the upper right. And some of these human hair flowers were incorporated into memorial pieces, to wax, yarn, thread, feathers, paper, bits of wood shavings, really anything. And then, of course, in the lower right, you can see that sometimes these likenesses of flowers, and some of them are quite botanically accurate, would then be combined with stuffed and mounted animals into sort of a naturalistic and nature display for the home. And so there was quite a bit of time spent doing this sort of thing. I suppose the winters were long, and this was one way to spend time. But I guess what I would remark on is the great observation of nature that many women engaged in to actually make close likenesses. The next slide. I have to mention the language of flowers, because I'm sure there are a lot of you wondering, so is she going to say something about the language of flowers? And of course, we've all seen these books. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of books published during the 19th century about expressing yourself using different groupings of flowers. If you're interested in this topic, Beverly Seaton wrote a wonderful evaluation of these called The Language of Flowers that was published a few years ago by the University of Virginia Press. But the whole idea was that you could use flowers to channel romantic thoughts and imagery. So a man could give a cluster of flowers to a woman, and each one had a particular meaning, or a woman could give a cluster of flowers to a man, and they would have some particular meaning. So the next slide, let's just pretend we're going to do this here. Okay, so let's get crazy here and try this. So upper left, we have Mimosa pudica. That's the sensitive plant. That, at least in some of the books, supposedly meant secret love. And upper right, we have Narcissus, malevolence. Lower left, we have Lobelia. Oh, I'm sorry, Narcissus means return my affection. Lower left, Lobelia, malevolence, and then Hydrangea, frigidity. So man, if a young man put together sensitive plant, narcissus, lobelia, and hydrangea in a little bouquet for a woman, he might be saying, "You are my secret love. Please return my affection. But in your eye, I sense malevolence, and maybe in your manner, I sense frigidity." Beverly Seton, however, says that she believes that this was rarely done, that these little books existed as little parlor pieces to look at and to admire, but that the likelihood that people actually made these little bouquets and used them to communicate romantic messages to each other was very remote. First of all, it would be almost impossible to get all four of those plants together, right? And when you see what these little bouquets look like, one is flowering in the summer and one's flowering in the spring, and it's just really impossible to get all of them together in a garden at the same time. So that's her opinion. And if you're interested in this, I would suggest pursuing Beverly Seton's book. Now, I want to talk. We're aiming toward the end of this, but I want to talk a little bit with the next few slides, about women who actually became botanists. Not all women limited their botanical studies to gardening, but some actually did become serious professional botanists. So I want to just look at a few of these women and tell you a bit about their history. This is Elmira Hart Lincoln Phelps, and she was a teacher and an educator. She was also one of the first few women to be named to the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. She was a textbook author. She did something a little bit adventurous and risque in her textbooks. She included what is known as the sexual system of classifications. And the next slide shows this. She was very interested in plant classification, and she included what we now call the Systema Sexuale of Linnaeus. So Linnaeus, remember, was an 18th century botanist. He died in 1778. During his career, he decided that the best way to classify plants was using their sexual parts. And so he had orders and families that were defined by the number of stamens, which make pollen, and the number of pistils that actually contain the structure that contains the egg that eventually becomes the seed. And Elmira Hart Lincoln Phelps actually included this in her textbooks. And she was criticized for this. Finally, when some Victorian era mothers and ministers found out that basically plant sex was being taught to young girls, it was just too prurient. It was just inappropriate. And many textbooks began to eliminate it, but she continued. She continued to teach it at the Troy Female Seminary. And her sister, by the way, was Emma Willard, who started the Emma Willard Academy in New York State. Next slide. Jane Loring Gray was the wife of Asa Gray, who was a botanist at Harvard. And you can see him with her, you can see in that picture there, and all the students around them. And this was the summer school of botany students, and Jane and Asa sitting right in the middle. And she worked side by side with Asa Gray with plant classification. He authored the famous Gray's Manual. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But even today, if you're learning New England botany, you want to have Gray's Manual with you when you're doing that. She also became an ardent conservationist because she saw what was happening as a result of an interest in wildflowers and making herbaria, and some women got interested in wildflower gardening. There were populations of wildflowers in New England that were being absolutely decimated by the 1870s and 1880s. She was actually the founder of the organization that has changed names. It was more recently the New England Wildflower Society. It's now the Native Plant Trust. They're the ones who operate Garden in the Woods in Framingham. But Jane Gray realized that we had to protect populations, particularly of the less frequent wildflowers, and keep them from being completely denuded. And she worked side by side with him also in writing textbooks. And the next slide shows you a couple of the books that it says Asa Gray, but there really should be a co-author here as well. First Lessons in Botany and Vegetable Physiology and the Elements of Botany for Beginners and for Schools. And these were aimed at elementary up through high school students. Next slide. Kate Furbish up in Maine. Kate Furbish was a self-trained field botanist. She was the first to realize that the lousewort in Maine is actually a semi-parasite on the alder trees. And she ended up with the Furbish lousewort being named for her. And she collected extensively. And she actually trained the botanist, Merritt Lincoln Fernald, who took over the authorship of Gray's Manual. So if you get a Gray's Manual now, the most recent one, that actually the author is Merritt Lincoln Fernald, who was trained by Kate Furbish. And there are 2 plants named for her in the New England flora. The next slide shows those. The Furbish lousewort is the one on the right. And that's the one where she actually realized that this plant is not entirely independent. It sends its roots into the alder trees. And those of us of a certain age remember that this was the little lousewort that stopped the Dickey Lincoln Dam project way up in northern Maine. And then on the left there, the Aster cordifolius variety Furbishii, that was an aster that she had collected. And it's a variety of an aster, New England aster, that was named for her as well. Next slide. This is Elizabeth Britton. She studied mosses along with her husband, who was Nathaniel Lord Britton, and working together, they founded the New York Botanical Garden. And she, on her own, authored 170 scientific papers on the botany of mosses. Next slide. Alice Eastwood. She was a California botanist. She was a self-taught botanist. She had Gray's Manual. She traveled and collected across the American West, often by herself, went into extremely remote areas. She was absolutely fearless. And she's best remembered today for saving the important type specimens in the museum after the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. The type specimens are the actual specimens that botanists saw when they first named a plant. And so there were many Western plants where the type specimens were in San Francisco, and the city was burning, and she rushed in and saved those specimens. The next slide. Frances Theodora Parsons, who also wrote under the name Mrs. William Starr Dana, she authored the first field guide to American wildflowers, and that was published in 1893, and it has been in print ever since. It is still in print with Dover Books. The next slide. I had to say something about Beatrix Potter. Now, we remember Beatrix really as a children's author, but she lived an isolated Victorian childhood in England, and one of the things that she was able to do was botanize. And she was the first to realize that a lichen, and you can see some lichens, little British soldiers up there in the upper left, that a lichen is actually not a single organism. It's actually a fungus species and an alga species, algae growing together. And she was brought to the Linnean Society, and she presented this, and they more or less ignored her. And of course, it turns out that she was right. She was the first one to realize this. But then look at the incredible detail in some of her botanical art. With a little bit of encouragement, I think we would remember her as a botanist and not as the author of children's books. Now, in closing, I want to talk a little bit about where all of this botany went at the end of the Victorian era. So the next slide, a little bit more on lichens. Yeah, these are the sorts of things that Beatrix observed, and very closely, just with the hand lens. Really wonderful things. Next slide. Okay, now where did all of this botany go? Well, a few different trends I want to talk about. This is Anna Botsford Comstock. So she was born in the middle of the Victorian era. came of age, and it was still Victorian America. And her project really was not so much botany as nature study. She was based at Cornell. Her husband is an entomologist. And she embraced the idea that children, particularly children in the inner cities, and you can just think about immigrant children being confined to tenements and slums. And her idea is we're going to have school gardens and we're going to get children out in the field to really observe nature. And so she really was the starting point for this field known as nature study. Her handbook of nature study was published in 1911. And really by 1920, it was a standard piece of school curriculum. And the whole idea of city children getting out in the fresh air, studying the natural world, making leaf collections, making flower collections still. This laid the groundwork for ecological studies and also for the war gardens of the First World War. And so during the First World War, shortages of fruits and vegetables, and the next slide shows this, meant that we did have gardening being promoted at home. And these were war gardens, and women were gardening and children were gardening, and there were a lot of these gardens at school. So again, sort of a return to practical botany, a return to practical horticulture. And this was supplying the American home front during World War II. And school gardening really became quite a thing. School gardens, many schools had gardens even between the wars, especially during the Depression. Next slide. Some of the posters associated with war gardens during World War I. Storing vegetables, fruits of victory, and the school garden movement way over on the right. Next slide. And then, of course, World War II, and we see the same movement repeated. Eleanor Roosevelt wanted to plant a victory garden. At that point, it was called a war garden at the White House. It was discouraged. Finally, after Pearl Harbor, she was able to get a garden started at the White House. The term victory garden was adopted, and some women joined the Land Army. The poster's way over on the right. The illustration up at the top, in the middle there, those are girls at Mount Holyoke College, and the one in the bottom is Smith College. So a lot of college women became involved in gardening, and there were all sorts of pamphlets and posters printed and disseminated widely. Again, largely work that was done by women, a practical sort of gardening. Next slide. And so where is all of this going today? Well, I can tell you, a lot of women are still studying plants. And this is a little cartoon from the New Yorker. Can you read it? It says, so she's at a party here. It says, I'm in herbs, celebrating the ancient link between women and plants. And this is no joke. Right now, there are in the vicinity of 70 online herbal academies where a lot of women, particularly young women, a lot of millennial women, are studying herbalism and learning about herbs. And I think some of the material they're learning is accurate. Some of it I think maybe is not too accurate. But anyway, an interest in botany is continuing. And I guess we'll see in the future where this all leads. So the next slide, I'm going to assign you some homework, right? So I want you don't have to do this, but I think it'd be a fun thing to do. Go to YouTube and search for The Horticultural Wife. This is a song that was very popular in the middle of the Victorian era. It was sung by the Hutchinson family. It was written by one of the Hutchinsons. And it is basically a parody, a musical parody of the tremendous interest that women had in gardening during the 19th century. And it lists for you, as they sing the song, it lists for you basically every flower that you would find in a typical Victorian parlor garden. And so it's fun. I think if you can find, you will find it on YouTube. If you search for The Horticultural Wife, I think you will enjoy it. That's your homework. Next slide. So if you enjoyed this talk, I will mention that my second book is titled American Household Botany. It was published by Timber. I think the paperback came out in maybe 2013 of this book. You can find it on Amazon. And it contains a lot of the information that I talked about tonight, plus a whole lot more. It goes through the history of plants used in American homes from the time of the earliest Puritans up through the turn of the last century, and looks not only at food plants and medicinal plants, but also timber and dyestuffs and fibers and the role of plants in children's education and a lot of the horticultural material that we talked about today. And I do have a website, judithsumner.com. You can find me on Facebook. I post maybe about once a week or so. I'm not real religious about it. And I tend to post information on horticulture, interesting new developments in botany, nothing terribly technical, medicinal botany, garden history, that sort of thing. And then I will say, since I have a captive audience, the next slide shows you my most recent book. This came out about a year ago, and it is indeed a botanical history of World War II. I think we just lost that slide. There it is. And you know, this is one of these little projects where I thought a botanical history of World War II would involve victory gardens and a little bit on agriculture and maybe a little bit on rationing and maybe a little bit on medicinal plants. And I had no idea what I was getting into. And if you're interested in botanical work done by women, I didn't write this book specifically about botanical work done by women, but I can tell you there's a lot of botanical work done by women in this book. If you go down several bullets there, German botany, herbalism, Lebensraum, and agriculture. In Nazi Germany, women were actually being taught practical herbalism as part of the Third Reich schools. Women were growing opium poppies. So I am done. If anyone has some questions, I will try to answer them.
Thank you very much, Judith. That was fascinating. And I know I have a couple of thoughts and comments too, but there's the question in chat for you. And we're a little over the hour, but it's Judith, if you're fine sticking around to answer some questions.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So
now I cannot see the chat. Am I going to be able to see it if I'm
going to read it to you.
The screen. Okay, you read it.
So how influential were the Shakers in preserving and promoting herbalism and botany?
How influential were the Shakers? Absolutely, extremely influential. The Shakers, in fact, had farms in which they grew herbs and also grew some plants specifically for seeds. So they sold not only herbs, but also seeds. And by the time we get to the Victorian era, the latter part of the Victorian era, they are also producing medicinal wines. They sort of got on the bandwagon with proprietary patent medicines. So when we say patent medicine, the actual thing that was patented was the bottle, and the mixture itself was proprietary. So I often call them patent and proprietary medicines, but the Shakers were doing their part. They were making different tonics and selling them as well. And in some areas, like around Harvard, Massachusetts, there are wild populations of plants like Veronicastrum that probably are escapees from Shaker herb farms. Absolutely. So they also sort of affected the flora in that regard, but definitely important. Yes.
Right,
and
great.
I might add, they grew a mixture. They grew whatever they thought worked. And so some of the plants they grew were European, some were Asian, some were Native American plants. They didn't get all bogged down with the native, non-native. If they thought it was an effective medicine, they grew it.
Great. And then another question, when did succulents become so popular for household gardening and why?
When did succulents become popular and why? They certainly are popular now, aren't they? But, well, you know who had a big succulent collection? Hitler. Hitler was fascinated by cacti. In fact, there was even a cactus named for him. It has since been renamed. So certainly, I can't think of any examples from the Victorian era of succulents in homes, but glass houses, like I'm thinking of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, they certainly had some pretty succulent plants in some of those glass houses. succulents were discovered in Africa, South America, and certainly in the true cacti come from North America. So I imagine, they were great curiosities, and probably some of their culture, at least at botanical gardens, dates to the 19th century.
Right. Well, I do know I was at our greenhouses at the Lyman Estate had a big succulent sale a couple of weeks ago, and I think that people they have and I don't know if it's necessarily true, but the perception that they're easy to care for because they don't require as much water. Maybe.
Yeah, don't overwater them though, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I had a question I wanted to throw into, if you don't mind, and you had mentioned early on in the lecture that women went out in their gardening dress. Was that different than what their everyday wear? Were their outfits for gardening, or were they out there gardening in their like long dresses and?
I think they wore long dresses, but maybe they weren't their best dresses, and maybe that would be a day that you could discard the corset, so you could bend over, right? I think it was what you could get away with.
Right.
But now wading out to get the algae, that was a challenge. You did have to tuck those dresses up and get out there.
All right, and lastly, I'll ask one more question if you don't mind, but I was wondering, we talked or focused on American. Was this emulating what was going on in Europe, like a lot of other trends?
Absolutely. Almost everything I talked about tonight started in England and then continued over here. Yeah, I think we were really following British style. And they were usually a little bit ahead of us, and especially with the American Civil War going on, some of this was sort of set aside during the Civil War years. Although I have to tell you, I have been reading, my next book is going to be a botanical history of the American Civil War. And so as you can imagine, it's back to the primary sources. And so I have been reading all these farm and home and agricultural journals. And they talk, and here in the middle of the war, they talk about beautiful flower gardens. And even in the ones in the South, the women were just trying to feed their families. And the guys writing these home journals were talking about raising beautiful flower gardens. So I think a lot of those were probably clipped and put on the shelf until after the war. But yes, so much of this, the bedding plants and the fascination with pansies and the pterodomania, this started in England and then made its way to the US. Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Judith. There's a note in here that thanking you and the formative presentation, people off to buy your books. So thank you so much. It was extremely interesting and informative, and I know I learned a great deal. So thank you for being here. And I hope to see everybody at the Glass Flowers talk next week. And in the meantime, I will throw out there in between now and then, we are live streaming the Handel and Haydn piano trio from the Lyman Estate on Sunday at 3 o'clock. If you are a historic New England member or a Handel and Haydn subscriber of more than $100 on that end, you can attend for free. You just need to register on our website. And if you are neither of those, you can still attend. There's a very modest sliding scale admission. So just wanted to put that out there. If you haven't signed up for that, it should be a great live stream. And again, thank you, Judith, very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I can't see anyone except for Michael, but have a pleasant evening, everybody, and thanks for attending the lecture.
That's okay. Thank you all very much, and have a good evening. Be well, everybody, and we'll see you next week, if not before.